What happens when a harmless joke at a party becomes the final straw that ends a marriage? I thought making my friends guess about my husband would make me look clever and bold, but he heard every word. He walked out that night, and weeks later, I realized his silence had been the start of his revenge. My name is Isolde Trent. I am 34, and I always said I had a sharp sense of humor. To me, a joke was just a joke, and if people laughed, then I had won. That night at a friend's party, I thought I was being clever when I turned my husband into the subject. I made my friends guess things about him, laughing louder each time they tried. I told myself it was harmless, that Daniel should learn to laugh at himself. But he was standing there, listening. He didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't even ask me to stop. He simply set his drink down, walked out the door, and never looked back. I tried calling him later, but he left every message on read. I told myself he was sulking, that he would come back when he calmed down. I didn't know then that his silence was the beginning of the end. It started at a friend's house party on a Saturday evening. The living room was crowded with music playing and drinks being poured, the kind of night where people let loose. I was sitting with my sister Clara and a few others when the conversation turned playful. Someone made a comment about couples and secrets, and before I knew it, I had turned the spotlight on Daniel. I smirked and said people could probably guess a lot about him if they tried. Clara laughed and pushed me to make it interesting. I felt the attention on me, and I thrived on that. So I leaned forward and suggested everyone guess things about my husband, even about his size. The table erupted in laughter, people shouting out numbers and silly remarks. I laughed the loudest. I told myself it was harmless, just light-hearted fun. I never stopped to think what it sounded like to him. Daniel was standing only a few feet away, talking with another group. I assumed he couldn't hear, but of course he could. He turned his head slightly, and I saw the flicker in his eyes before he looked away. I thought he would come over and tell me to stop, maybe pull me aside and scold me. I almost wanted him to, because then I could accuse him of being insecure. Instead, he said nothing. He placed his glass down carefully on the counter, nodded politely at someone, and walked out the front door. The sound of it shutting was louder than the music. I froze for a moment, then laughed louder than before, telling everyone he was being dramatic. Clara slapped her knee and said he needed to lighten up. A few others nodded, but some shifted uncomfortably. I brushed that off, deciding they were just boring people who didn't get my sense of humor. As the night went on, I told the story again to a few who had missed it. I joked that Daniel had left because he couldn't handle being the butt of a joke. I told Clara he had no sense of humor, that he always made me feel like I was walking on eggshells, when really I was just having fun. She agreed, and said some men couldn't handle strong women. The more she supported me, the more confident I felt. By the time I got home, I had convinced myself I was right and he was wrong. The house was dark when I walked in. Daniel wasn't waiting up for me like he usually did. I called his name, but there was no answer. I texted him, but the messages showed as read with no reply. I muttered to myself that he was sulking and went to bed. The next morning, he got up early, made breakfast for the kids, and left for work without saying more than a few words to me. His silence annoyed me. I poked at him, asking if he was really going to give me the cold shoulder over a joke. He just said he had work to do and walked out. I rolled my eyes, telling myself he was acting like a child. Later that week, I retold the story at my parents' house. My father chuckled, though not as loudly as Clara. My mother pursed her lips but said nothing. I said Daniel had walked out because he couldn't take a joke, and Clara jumped in, saying men like him were fragile. I added that Damien, one of the trainers at the gym, would never act that way if someone teased him. My father raised his eyebrows, but I ignored it. I painted Daniel as too sensitive, too boring, too rigid. I made myself the fun one, the lively one. When I got home that evening, Daniel was sitting quietly in the living room, reading something on his phone. I tried to bait him again, asking if he was still upset. He looked up at me, calm, and said I would understand soon. That was all. Then he returned to his phone. I hated that answer because it gave me nothing to work with. I wanted anger. I wanted a fight, something I could twist into proof he was the problem. Instead, he stayed silent. I turned to the children for validation. Sophie asked why Daddy didn't talk to me much anymore. I told her he was busy and moody, that men sometimes needed space. She frowned but didn't argue. Evan was too young to understand, but I told him the same. I thought if I controlled the story, I could keep them on my side. That week, Clara called and told me I had done the right thing, that Daniel needed to be taken down a peg. Her encouragement fueled me. I told her I didn't regret the joke, that if Daniel wanted to leave a party over nothing, that was his choice. I kept repeating that line to myself until I believed it, but deep down, something about his silence unsettled me. He wasn't sulking in the way I had seen before. He wasn't pacing or raising his voice. He was calm, steady, too steady. I tried to shake it off, telling myself he was just brooding. Still, the memory of the way he left that party played in my mind. No anger, no scene, just quiet resolve. And that made me wonder, for the first time, if maybe I had pushed him further than I thought. At first I told myself Daniel's silence would break. I had seen him upset before, and usually after a few days he would talk again. He would sulk, I would tease him, and eventually things would settle. But this time felt different. He went about his days as if I wasn't there. He got up early, made breakfast for the kids, packed their lunches, left for work, and came home without once asking me where I had been or what I was doing. He answered my questions with short phrases, never starting a conversation of his own. It was like living with a stranger, and the more he pulled away, the more I tried to prove to others that I was still in control. I started going to the gym more often. Ryan, the trainer there, was friendly in a way Daniel wasn't anymore. He asked about my day, told me I looked great when I finished a workout, and offered to spot me. I let him. I told myself it was harmless, just normal interaction, but I liked the way his attention filled the silence Daniel left at home. I even told Clara about Ryan, saying it was refreshing to be noticed. She laughed and said Daniel should be worried. I brushed it off, saying Daniel was too wrapped up in his pride to notice anything these days. One afternoon at the gym cafe, Ryan sat with me while I sipped a smoothie. He leaned back and joked that I deserved better than a man who walked out over jokes. I smiled, enjoying the validation, and repeated that Daniel was too sensitive. I said he wanted everything serious, never fun. Ryan shook his head and said some men didn't know how lucky they were. I let myself believe him. At home, I painted Daniel as moody and controlling, even when he barely spoke to me at all. When Sophie asked again why Daddy wasn't talking to me much, I told her he was just tired and couldn't handle me being the fun parent. I said sometimes men had egos and didn't like it when women got attention. She looked confused, but nodded. Evan asked if Daddy was mad at me. I laughed and said Daddy was always moody. I convinced myself I was protecting them by making light of it. My parents began to notice too. Over dinner one Sunday, I told them Daniel barely spoke anymore. My father frowned and said maybe he had been hurt by my words at the party. I waved him off, saying he needed to toughen up. Clara jumped in, saying I'd only been funny and that Daniel had embarrassed himself by leaving. My mother asked softly if I thought I had gone too far. I said she was exaggerating, that Daniel needed to grow a sense of humor. I told them Ryan had even said I deserved better, hoping it would make me look supported. My mother gave me a sharp look then, but my father stayed quiet. Clara laughed, calling Ryan a good guy. Daniel's mother, Margaret, was another matter. She stopped visiting and refused to answer when I called. When she finally did, she said I had humiliated her son in public and that she wanted no part of it. I told her she was biased, that she always thought I wasn't good enough. She hung up without another word. I told myself it didn't matter, that she was just bitter, but it gnawed at me anyway. By then, Daniel had stopped reacting altogether. One night after the kids went to bed, I pushed him again, asking if he was really going to freeze me out forever. He looked up from his paperwork, calm as always, and said I would understand soon. That was all. The words chilled me because they weren't dramatic. They were steady, final. I tried to laugh it off, but the way he looked at me made me uneasy. To save face, I leaned harder into my narrative. With friends, I repeated the story of the party, making Daniel the punchline. I said he had walked out because he couldn't handle a bit of fun, that he was insecure about himself, that I shouldn't have to tiptoe around a man who lacked confidence. People laughed politely, but I noticed the way some of them looked at each other when I spoke. A few didn't laugh at all. I told myself they were boring, but deep down I knew they were judging. At the gym, Ryan began to keep his distance. He still smiled, but he didn't sit with me anymore. He said he was busy with clients when I asked him to join me after workouts. I told myself he was just careful not to get dragged into drama, but I felt the shift. Even he wasn't giving me the same attention. Back at home, the silence grew heavier. The children clung to Daniel more than me. They laughed with him, followed him around the house, asked him for help with homework. I told myself it was because he spoiled them, but I could feel them slipping away. I tried to guilt Daniel, telling him he was turning the kids against me by ignoring me. He simply looked at me and said nothing. That silence was worse than words, because I couldn't twist it into a fight. By the end of that week, I realized I no longer controlled the story. My jokes were sounding less like humor and more like cruelty, even to my own ears. But I kept going, because admitting I was wrong felt impossible. Still, whenever Daniel repeated those quiet words, "You will understand soon," I felt the ground shifting under me. I just didn't know yet how much I was about to lose. The whispers at the gym turned into stares at work gatherings, and suddenly, I could feel eyes on me everywhere I went. People didn't laugh at my stories as freely anymore. When I tried to joke again about Daniel being too sensitive, the room went quiet. Someone even said maybe I should stop talking about him that way. I brushed it off, forcing a laugh, but their silence pressed on me like a weight. At home, the silence was worse. Daniel moved through the house like a ghost, steady and calm, but always distant. I tried to bait him, mocking him under my breath, making digs about how at least Ryan noticed me. He never rose to it. He just tucked Evan into bed, helped Sophie with her reading, and closed himself in his room with papers I never bothered to ask about. When Clara came over, I tried to use her as an ally again. I told her Daniel was still sulking, that he was punishing me with silence. Clara laughed and said he was being pathetic, that he was letting me win without even trying. I grinned at her words, but the grin faded when I caught Sophie staring at me from the hallway. She asked later why I always made fun of Daddy. I told her I was only joking, but her small voice said quietly that Daddy didn't look like he thought it was funny. I snapped at her to mind her own business, then felt guilty afterward. Evan hugged me tightly that night, and I wondered if even he could feel the house splitting apart. At Sunday dinner with my parents, I pushed harder to paint Daniel as the problem. I told them he never spoke to me anymore, that he was cold and distant, that he was making me feel like a stranger in my own house. My father sighed and said maybe he had been hurt more than I realized. My mother asked if I thought I owed him an apology. I laughed at her suggestion, saying he was playing the victim. Clara jumped in, saying I had done nothing wrong, and that Daniel was weak for walking out of the party in the first place. My father looked at her with disappointment but didn't argue. My mother frowned and said she worried I was pushing things too far. I dismissed them both, choosing Clara's support over their warnings. Later that week, Daniel's mother Margaret called. Her voice was sharp, cutting through me before I could even speak. She said she had heard everything, that I had shamed her son in front of friends and family, that I had made a mockery of him. I tried to defend myself, saying it was just a joke, that Daniel was too sensitive. She didn't buy it. She said I had ruined my own marriage and hung up on me. I threw the phone down, furious, but the sting of her words stayed with me. Ryan, too, was slipping away. When I tried to meet him after the gym, he said he was busy. When I texted him, he replied with short answers. Eventually, he stopped replying at all. I cornered him once near the lockers, demanding to know if he was avoiding me. He shrugged and said he didn't want to be caught in drama. Then he walked away, leaving me standing there with my face hot and my heart pounding. I told myself he was weak, that he didn't deserve me anyway. But deep down, I knew I had lost even the flimsy attention I had been clinging to. One evening, Daniel came back from taking the kids to his mother's. Sophie and Evan rushed inside with their overnight bags, laughing, while he followed calmly behind. He kissed them on the forehead, helped them unpack their things, and then walked into the kitchen where I was standing. Without a word, he placed a sealed envelope on the counter. He met my eyes for just a moment, steady, unblinking, then turned and walked out. The door closed behind him with the same quiet finality as it had at the party. I stared at the envelope for a long time before tearing it open. Inside were papers I didn't understand at first. Bank records, phone logs, screenshots of conversations I thought I had deleted. At the back was a letter from a lawyer. My name was typed neatly at the top, and the words below made my stomach twist. Petition for divorce, custody filings, financial disclosures. Each page felt heavier than the last, proof that Daniel had been watching, preparing, building something while I was too busy laughing at him. I dropped the papers on the counter, my hands shaking. For weeks I had mocked him, told myself he was weak, convinced others he was insecure, and all the while he had been quietly turning my own words into weapons. His silence hadn't been surrender. It had been strategy. I thought I had humiliated him, but he was already setting the stage to dismantle me completely. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat awake replaying every moment, the party, the jokes, the times I laughed louder just to feel powerful. I remembered Sophie's small voice asking why I always made fun of Daddy. I remembered Evan clinging to Daniel when he returned from work. And now I saw it clearly. While I was turning him into the punchline, he was turning me into evidence. I wanted to believe I still had control, that I could twist this, that I could convince my family Daniel was cruel. But staring at those papers, I felt the first real crack in the story I had built. For the first time, I wondered if maybe his silence was not weakness at all, but the quiet strength that would cost me everything. I sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread out in front of me, my fingers smudging the ink as I tried to make sense of them. Divorce, custody, financial disclosures. The words blurred together, but I knew exactly what they meant. Daniel wasn't sulking, he wasn't pouting, he wasn't playing the victim. He was done. Panic hit me, and I thought the only thing I could do was fight back. So I grabbed my phone and called Ryan, needing someone to tell me Daniel couldn't possibly follow through. Ryan answered after a long pause, his voice clipped. I begged him to look at the documents, to back me up, to stand with me if this went to court. He sighed and said he didn't want to get involved. I pushed harder, telling him that Daniel was trying to ruin me, that if he cared about me at all, he had to help. Ryan went quiet, then said it wasn't his problem. He told me not to drag him into this mess again and hung up. When I tried to call back, he ignored it. Later, I realized he had blocked me. I threw the phone down, shaking. The man I had flaunted as proof of my desirability had cut me off without hesitation. He had been a game, and now that the game turned serious, he wanted nothing to do with me. That night, when Daniel came home, I confronted him. I waved the papers in his face and demanded to know what he thought he was doing. He sat at the table calmly, sipping his tea. I shouted that he was tearing the family apart, that he was punishing me for nothing, that he was destroying the children's lives just to hurt me. He looked up then, his face steady, and said he was protecting them. That answer infuriated me. I told him he was selfish, that he was twisting everything to make himself look noble. I accused him of being weak, too cowardly to fight for me, too small to forgive. He didn't respond. He didn't argue. He just let me yell until my throat hurt, then quietly stood, picked up the papers, and left the room. The silence he left behind felt heavier than the shouting I had wanted. The next day, I ran to my parents, hoping they would take my side. I showed them the documents, my voice shaking as I explained how Daniel was trying to ruin me. My father sighed deeply and said, maybe I should have seen this coming. My mother said quietly that Daniel had always been good to me and that maybe I had gone too far. I exploded, insisting they were betraying me, that they were taking his side. Clara jumped in, as usual, saying Daniel was being controlling, that he couldn't handle me being fun and free. But even her voice didn't sound as sure as before. My parents exchanged a look, and I realized even they were beginning to see through me. Margaret, his mother, didn't bother with silence. She called me and told me straight that I had broken my own marriage. She said her son had finally found the strength to cut me off, and she was proud of him. I screamed at her, saying she had poisoned him against me from the start. She hung up on me mid-sentence. The children noticed the tension too. Sophie asked why Daddy had given me those papers. I told her he was trying to hurt me, that he wanted to take her and Evan away. She shook her head and said Daddy loved them too much to do that. Evan clung to Daniel's leg when he came to pick them up that weekend, refusing to let go. Watching that made my chest ache, but I told myself Daniel was manipulating them. I whispered to myself that I was still the fun parent, that they would choose me if they had to. But deep down, I saw the truth in their eyes. That evening, when Daniel dropped them off again, he didn't speak to me. He helped them put away their things, kissed them goodnight, and left without a glance in my direction. I shouted after him, asking if he was proud of what he was doing, if he realized he was destroying us. The door shut quietly behind him, leaving me yelling into an empty hallway. Later that night, I sat alone with the papers again, trying to convince myself I could spin this. I told myself I could make the judge see that Daniel was cold, that he was punishing me unfairly. I told myself I could make my parents pity me, make Clara rally people to my side. But the more I tried to weave the story, the more it unraveled in my hands. The evidence was too strong, the silence too sharp. Daniel didn't need to argue with me. He had already won, and I was the last one to realize it. I poured myself a glass of wine, telling myself he would cave if I begged hard enough, if I promised to change, if I showed him I was sorry. But when I thought of the way he had looked at me, calm and steady, I knew begging wouldn't matter. Daniel wasn't coming back to argue or forgive. He was coming back only to finish what he had started, and nothing I said could stop it. The courthouse was colder than I expected, not in temperature, but in the way the walls seemed to swallow every sound. I walked in wearing my best dress, holding my head high, determined to show that I was not afraid. If I looked confident, I told myself, maybe the judge would see me as the victim. Daniel was already there, sitting beside his lawyer. He didn't look at me, didn't fidget, didn't even tap his foot. He sat still, hands folded, as though he had already accepted everything. His calm unsettled me more than anger ever could. When the proceedings began, his lawyer laid out the evidence one piece at a time. Bank statements showing my spending, screenshots of messages with Ryan that I thought I had deleted, statements from friends who had been at the party, recalling the way I mocked Daniel in front of everyone, even notes from teachers saying Sophie and Evan seemed calmer after spending weekends with their father. Each word landed like a blow. I wanted to stand up and shout that it was unfair, that none of it mattered, that jokes didn't define a marriage, but my own lawyer shook his head, warning me silently not to make things worse. When it was my turn to speak, I leaned forward and insisted that Daniel was punishing me. I said he was twisting everything to make himself look like the hero, that he was only silent because he wanted to trap me. I told the judge I was the one keeping the family alive, that my humor was what made our lives less dull. The words sounded strong in my head, but when I spoke them aloud, they rang hollow. The judge's expression didn't change. Daniel didn't even look at me. He just kept his eyes on the table, as though I wasn't worth acknowledging. During recess, I called my parents from the hallway. My father's voice was heavy when he answered. He said, maybe I should stop fighting and think about what was best for the children. My mother said she still loved me, but couldn't defend the choices I had made. Their words stung more than Daniel's silence. I hung up quickly before they could say more. Clara texted me, telling me to hold my ground, but even her words felt thin, like she no longer believed in them herself. Back inside, the focus shifted to the house. Daniel's lawyer argued that Sophie and Evan needed stability, that keeping the family home with their father would ensure consistency. I clenched my fists under the table. That was my home too, the place I had decorated, the place where my things filled every corner. But as the arguments went on, I realized the judge agreed. The children needed stability, and Daniel provided it. I was left imagining my things boxed up, shoved into storage, while he and the children carried on in the house I had mocked as too small. When the issue of custody came, my chest tightened. Daniel's lawyer spoke of routines, of calmness, of the children's need for a safe environment. He produced notes from Sophie's teacher, describing how she seemed brighter, more focused after time with her father. He presented a counselor's note saying Evan had told him Daddy made him feel safe. I wanted to scream that I was their mother, that no paper could take them away from me. But when I looked at the judge, I saw the decision had already been made. My protest sounded desperate, brittle, and small. The ruling came down with finality, primary custody to Daniel. I was granted visitation, scheduled and monitored. The house to Daniel for the sake of stability. Financial protections to ensure I could not drain accounts again. My lawyer leaned close and whispered that the ruling was fair, that it was better than it could have been. Fair. That word burned through me. Nothing about this felt fair. I wanted to shout that I was being punished for nothing more than a joke, that everyone had blown it out of proportion. But the words stuck in my throat. When the gavel came down, Daniel stood and collected his papers. He didn't look at me, not once. He didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't show the smallest hint of triumph. He simply walked out, leaving me behind with nothing but the echo of the ruling. His silence followed me like a shadow. As I walked out of the courthouse, my dress felt too tight, my heels unsteady. People avoided my eyes. The same people who had once laughed at my jokes now looked at me with pity or contempt. I told myself they didn't understand, that Daniel had fooled them. But deep down, I knew the truth. He hadn't needed to fool anyone. He had let me do all the work. My words, my arrogance, my games, they had destroyed me, and he had simply stood back and let the truth unfold. By the time I reached my car, I realized the silence that had once driven me mad had been his sharpest weapon. He didn't have to argue with me. He didn't have to defend himself. He had let me mock him, let me laugh, let me humiliate him. And then he had taken everything back with calm, steady hands. I sat behind the wheel, shaking, knowing I had lost, not because he fought me, but because he never had to. The motel room I ended up in was nothing like the home I once mocked for being too small. The carpet smelled of old smoke, the curtains were faded, and the air conditioner rattled like it was ready to fall apart. I sat on the bed with the divorce papers spread out in front of me, staring at the words I had read 100 times already. Primary custody, Daniel Trent. Marital home, Daniel Trent. Financial safeguards, all in his name. My name was there too, but only as a reminder of what I had lost. I told myself it wasn't over, that I could still turn things around, but even I didn't believe the lies anymore. Ryan was gone. The man I once flaunted for attention had vanished without a trace. His number sent me to voicemail, my messages bounced back, and at the gym he avoided me so carefully, it was as though I had never existed. Clara still answered my calls, but her voice lacked the certainty it once had. She told me she didn't know what else to say, that maybe I should stop trying to make Daniel the villain. My parents rarely picked up anymore. When my mother did, she asked only about Sophie and Evan, nothing about me. My father barely spoke at all. Even Margaret's silence was sharp. She wouldn't say my name, wouldn't acknowledge me at all. The isolation grew louder every day, until the only voice left was my own. I tried to cling to the children, but even that slipped through my fingers. During visits, they were polite but distant. Sophie answered my questions with short words, her eyes drifting toward the clock. Evan hugged me, but then launched into stories about Daddy, about pancakes in the morning, about forts in the living room, about bedtime stories I had stopped telling long ago. I smiled and nodded, pretending I was happy to hear it, but inside it hollowed me out. They were no longer mine in the way they once had been. They were Daniel's now, drawn to his steady calm, his quiet strength. At night, I replayed the moment it all started. That stupid party, that stupid game I thought would make me the center of attention. The way I laughed louder than anyone else when my friends guessed. The way I told myself it was harmless, that Daniel needed to lighten up. I thought I was clever. I thought I was bold. But when I saw the look on his face, calm, steady, almost empty, I should have known. He didn't argue because he didn't need to. He walked out the door without a word, and that silence was the beginning of the end. I tried to rewrite the story in my head. I told myself I was punished for being funny, that Daniel had overreacted, that no marriage should fall apart over a joke. I whispered those words into the empty room, hoping they would sound convincing. But the walls didn't answer, and deep down I knew the truth. It wasn't just the joke. It was the years of mocking, the arrogance, the way I humiliated him in front of others, the way I turned him into the punchline of my life. The joke was only the spark. The fire had been burning long before. Sometimes I scrolled through old photos on my phone, pictures of the four of us at the park, Daniel pushing Sophie on the swings while Evan rode on his shoulders, pictures of birthdays, candles lit on cakes, Daniel smiling quietly in the background while I posed in the center. I used to think those photos proved I was the star, that he was just the backdrop. Now, sitting alone in this room, I saw how wrong I was. He had been the foundation holding it all together, and without him, everything collapsed. I poured myself cheap wine from the store across the street, the kind that tasted like vinegar, and told myself it would numb me. It didn't. It only made the silence louder. I tried calling Daniel once more, just to hear his voice, even if he didn't answer. The line rang and rang, then went to voicemail. I didn't bother leaving a message. I already knew he wouldn't listen. The papers lay on the bed like a sentence already carried out. Final decree of divorce. Custody granted, assets divided, no room for negotiation, no space for me to twist the story. It was all decided, sealed, done. I stared at my own name, printed in black ink, and wondered how I had managed to throw everything away for a laugh. Daniel never shouted, he never begged, he never argued. He just gathered the truth, piece by piece, and let me destroy myself with my own words. And when the time came, he walked away with everything. Our home, our children, his dignity, while I was left with nothing but the echo of my arrogance. Now the only sound in this room is the ticking of the cheap motel clock. Each second reminds me of what I lost, of how I laughed at the man who gave me everything, and how he ended it all without raising his voice. I thought I had made him small, but in the end, it was me who disappeared into silence. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.